Sehr herzlich begrüßen zu unserem Soziologie-Webcast zum Thema Demokratie und Religion, Religion oder Demokratie. Das Thema könnte aktueller nicht sein. Österreich erlebt im Moment gerade einen Wirbelwind an religionspolitischen Themen. Natürlich ausgelöst durch die tragischen Ereignisse in Wien, der Terroranschlag mit Todesopfern, der eine Debatte über den politischen Islam ausgelöst hat. Wenige Tage später dann die Razzia gegen Muslimbrüder, die wiederum die Debatte über den politischen Islam und den vermeintlichen, sozusagen dieses vermeintliche Phänomen und den richtigen Umgang damit befeuert hat in der Politik und in der öffentlichen Debatte. Aber damit nicht genug. Schlagzeilen machte auch das Gebet zur Adventszeit im Parlament. Und in den letzten Tagen hat der Verfassungsgerichtshof mit Urteilen auf sich aufmerksam gemacht. Einmal die Aufhebung des Verbots vom Tragen von Kopftüchern für muslimische Mädchen in Volksschulen. Der Verfassungsgerichtshof hat das Verbot aufgehoben, weil es nicht religionsneutral ist, weil es eine Religion diskriminierend herausnimmt. An diesem gleichen Freitag letzter Woche hat der Verfassungsgerichtshof aber auch noch in einer anderen Sache ein Urteil ausgesprochen, das religionspolitisch relevant ist, und zwar zur Frage der Sterbehilfe, des assistierten Selbstmords. Und zuletzt, gestern, ganz aktuell, hat die Bundesregierung einen Gesetzesvorschlag vorgestellt gegen einen neuen Straftatbestand des religiösen Extremismus, soll in das österreichische Strafrecht eingeführt werden, gegen religiösen Extremismus, also sozusagen als eine religionsneutrale Formulierung, wo vorher politischer Islam gemeint war. Das sind alles wichtige Fragen, und die möchte ich heute mit zwei Personen diskutieren, die besser dafür nicht geeignet sein könnten. Der eine ist José Casanova, er ist ein weltbekannter Religionssoziologe. Sein Buch Public Religions in the Modern World von 1994 ist ein Modern Classic für alle Religionssoziologen und darüber hinaus. Und nicht zuletzt, das wissen gar nicht so viele, José Casanova ist ein Alumnus der Universität Innsbruck. Er hat in Innsbruck studiert und in Innsbruck gelebt, und er ist auch er hat ein Ehrendoktorat in Theologie der Universität Innsbruck, und er hat deswegen auch gleich zugesagt, auf die Einladung hier mitzudiskutieren. Und Mitdiskutant ist auch Wolfgang Palaver, ein nicht minder bekannter Theologe, systematischer Theologe der Universität Innsbruck. Ja, ich würde sagen, Sie merken auch im Gespräch, wir kennen uns alle lange und sind gute Freunde, und ich freue mich, dass wir hier diskutieren können. And now I'll switch to English, because we said we would do the discussion in English, but everyone can ask questions in German. Sie können auf Deutsch Fragen stellen. José versteht auch ganz gut Deutsch. And so it will work like this. First, I'll give the floor to you, José, and you will make sort of your statement on these questions that we are planning to discuss today, and then I'll hand on to Wolfgang, and then we will enter a discussion. So the floor is to you, José.
Okay, thank you very much, Kristina. It's a pleasure to be here again in Innsbruck, if only digitally. And thank you so much for the invitation. Good evening, everybody. It is noon here in New York. I want to make 3 points briefly. The first is the role of religion in the public sphere of modern societies. This was basically the thesis of my book in 1994, that both empirically and normatively, there was no reason to say that religions were private and ought to remain private affairs in modern democratic societies. There was an argument at the time that changed the paradigm, the discussion of religion and politics, and thereafter a philosopher like Jürgen Habermas accepted the thesis and began to talk about religion in the public sphere and about post-secular societies. So the argument is that all citizens, religious and not religious, secular, and of members of all religions have the right as citizens to bring their norms, their values, their models of society, of the common good, how they would like to organize society, into public discussion in the public sphere of civil societies. And modern democracy should not discriminate against citizens, any either religious or not religious. So this is the fundamental thesis. The second is more empirically about European societies and the difficulties they have in accepting, if you wish, meeting the challenge of religious pluralism. European societies were not organized on the principle of religious pluralism, on the contrary, and so they have great difficulties. 5 years ago, precisely at this same time, when also and even as much a crime was committed by Muslim jihadists in Paris on November 13th, at that very same day, I sat down to write the laudatio for German Chancellor Angela Merkel upon the reception of the Abraham Geiger Prize at the Jewish Museum that took place on December 2nd, 2015. And precisely how can you talk about religious pluralism and the need of accepting religious pluralism as central to the foundation and to the function of democracies after such a criminal act made in the name of religion? And this was the whole argument. I sat down to write this laudatio precisely the afternoon when the terrible crimes in Paris took place. And so it was a fundamental challenge to legitimate the need to recognize religious pluralism as a fundamental value of modern democratic societies. I dealt with the Jewish question because the Jewish question is so central to the difficulties of European societies to accept religious minorities. And I compared the Muslim question to the Jewish question. It was on purpose, it was controversial, but actually all the people, the Jewish people in the audience, in the Jewish Museum, religious leaders, political leaders, intellectuals actually accepted the argument and saw the parallels between the Muslim question today and the Jewish question in the past. So this is the second point. The need to come to terms with the reality of religious pluralism, which is irremediable in our modern global context. And the third is not only the parallels between the Jewish question in the past and the Muslim question today, but the parallels with the anti-Muslim discourse today and the anti-Catholic discourse of the past in Protestant societies during the so-called Kulturkämpfe in Germany, in Great Britain, but especially in the United States. Again, the argument basically was there is this religion, Popist religion, organized around the Pope, that is fundamentally fundamentalist, anti-liberal, anti-modern, anti-democratic, and unchangeable. And therefore, because the religion is like that, Catholic immigrants in those societies represent this religion, embody this religion, and they should not be accepted as citizens because their loyalties is to the Pope in Rome. Very similar arguments are made today about Islam. Islam being a fundamentalist, anti-modern, anti-liberal religion, and therefore Muslim immigrants, whether they are religious or not, they precisely come to embody, to represent Islam, and that's why they have no room in European societies, either secular or Christian. This is an argument which religious people do not make today in Europe, Christian, but post-ex-Christian people have a tendency to do. So basically, these were the 3 points I wanted to make, and we can expand them in the conversation. Of course, the question is, how can you compare the issue of Muslim terrorism? And we can discuss the issue of terrorism. It's a fundamental problem for modern societies. It's a problem of national security. It's a problem for national police forces, international security agencies to work together to make sure that those acts do not happen and to punish the perpetrators. But we should not confuse these problems with the recognition of Islam as a religion. In the past, we have waves of terrorism, anarchist terrorism at the end of the 19th century, then terrorism of the Red Brigades in the 60s, and nobody would say that because somebody committed a crime in the name of Marxism or socialism, Marxism, socialism should be forbidden, and all socialists and communists should be excluded from political life. So the argument I want to make is, please, let's compare and let's differentiate various issues.
Okay, thank you very much for these three very clear points. So it's about equal public debate, religious pluralism, and as a democratic value, and a differentiated perspective on religions, recognizing religions as what they are and the problems as what they are, ones of crime and the others of freedom of conscience, really. So thank you very much. And now I turn to Wolfgang for your introductory statement.
Yeah, thank you very much also for the nice invitation. It's a pleasure to contribute to our discussion, and I can continue on the third point of Jose. Preparing this talk today, I read his very important article, The Politics of Nativism, where he compares the attitude towards Islam in Europe with the former or long-standing attitude of United States Protestants over against Catholicism. And in this article, he makes an interesting observation that he says one of the problems in Europe consists in the fact that Islam is constructed as the other, both by Christian Europe, that's the first group, and then also by secular Europe. And Christian Europe in this construction of Islam and secular Europe in this construction of Islam joined together in a quite negative attitude towards Islam. And when I was thinking about that, I just watched yesterday the announcement of this new law against the law bill against terrorism, extremism in Europe. And I was thinking, we have now a government of the ÖVP, the Austrian People's Party, and the Green Party. And both parties in some way represent both these attitudes that Jose described. So they have a very different perspective on religion. The Austrian People's Party is quite favorable of religion, of Christianity. You see that in regard to religious education. You see that in a very strange act of a prayer that happened in the parliament just on your last feast day on December 8th. So the Austrian People's Party tries to strengthen Christianity, even the Catholic profile of Austria, as you see in this strange prayer in the parliament. And it's very critical of Islam. So again and again, they, for a couple of years, address the problem of so-called political Islam, using a term that scientifically seen is very problematic and not very helpful, but politically it works with a lot of people. And because this term also joins together this Christian Europe construction of Islam with the secular Europe construction of Islam. So yesterday, this law bill was announced. And this law bill, which is a good thing, does not name political Islam in the text for the law, but talks about religiously motivated extremism. But Integration Minister Susanne Raab yesterday on TV and today in radio clearly said, of course, we think about political Islam. That's the danger, and we have to do something. So the second group is the I want to say something critical. This first attitude is in danger to use religion for political purposes. And we should be, as religious people or theologians, be very careful about this political use. So I was recently reading a very new book by Pope Francis with the title Let Us Dream. It just came out about 10 days ago. I highly recommend this book. And in this book, he talks about national populism and some tendency in countries with Christian minorities to defend Christian civilization against Islam, against Jews, against the European Union, against the United Nations, and makes the remark that this is creating fears and building up on fears in a time when at the same time the attendance at churches is declining. So people don't go to the church, so the really religious commitment is declining, but at the same time Christian identity is very much strengthened. So religiously seen, it's a very difficult and problematic attitude, and Pope Francis justly criticizes that. The second temptation is now more at home with the Austrian Green Party, the smaller party of the coalition government, and it represents the typical secular view of religion. For them, religion in general is suspicious. It is to their merit, we have to say, that the concept political Islam is not in the new law bill, but they, of course, are surely responsible for the new concept, the religiously motivated extremism, because they see religion as essentially prone to conflict, violence, and threatening human rights. But the question is, do we need a law that especially addresses religion in regard to extremism? I mean, we have all the laws against terrorism, against violence, against violation of human rights and extremism. There is no need to address a special religious motivation. We should be aware of all the dangers. But because the secular people in Europe see religion as a problem, so they have no problem to address this dangerous problem of religion, and their attitude is to support understanding of religion that sees religion as nothing but a private matter. But to see religion as nothing but a private matter is against the grain, goes against the grain of almost all religions. So if you force religions to become completely private, you in some way attack religion fundamentally, which is completely wrong. Of course, when I emphasize that every religion also has its public or political dimension, I do not mean that there is not a need of a clear separation between religion and the state with its coercive means. And again, we can learn from José Casanova that the public space for religions in the modern society is civil society. So we have to talk about that. The big problem, and I will stop with that remark, the big problem is that these two different approaches, so the approach who tries to strengthen religion or Christianity for strongly political purposes on the one hand, and the secular view of religion and their constructions of Islam, they can join together against Islam, although they have a very different view of religion. The one see religion as very dangerous. The one see Christian religion, especially Catholicism in Austria, as very good, and Islam as very and highly suspicious. And I think that's a little bit the problem in Austria, and it's also the problem that quite a big majority now has a quite negative attitude towards Islam. And of course, any terrorist event, as we had it recently in Vienna, is easily going in that patterns. But it doesn't help, because if we would go along that direction, we would make the problem even worse. So thank you. That's the first
Thank you. Thank you, Wolfgang. At this point, I want to say to the audience that you can ask your questions in the chat, but I want to start the question in a way, and I want to give our conversation a complicating spiral turn. And I start with something that José said. José, you said that the Catholic Church in the United States was received with a lot of suspicion in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and even maybe later, because it was considered as something unchangeable. It was anti-liberal, it was anti-democratic, and to some extent, that was even true for the Catholic Church at that time. And of course, a lot of changes did happen in the Catholic Church. So the question really is, and now it's not only about change. it's about that term aggiornamento that you use, that is used referring to the Second Vatican Council. And you completely take that point and you should pick it up, but then I want to make it even one more complicated. I mean, you know my research about the Russian Orthodox Church, where I basically show that there's a lot of change. There's not a lack of change, but it's not necessarily going in a direction of making a religion more easily compatible with a liberal democracy or with democracy even at all. So I would like both of you, I'd like to ask them, we've now spoken about religion, sort of a politicized religion, about secularism, but what about change in religion?
Well, let me here introduce, you may not remember, but the famous speech of Pope Francis in the US Congress, in which basically he reminded that every religion has the, if you wish, the temptation of nationalism and of violence, and that no religion is free from that, including, of course, Christianity and Catholicism. And, of course, the Pope knew very well the temptations of Catholicism. So, and he recognizes the inner transformation of Catholicism. So here, of course, has to do with the relation between then religion and religious truths and the kind of transformations of society. And different religions are going to have different relations with the external world in different times. The important thing is that no religion per se is fundamentalist, immune to change. And the argument I would make is if the Catholic Church could change of all religions, then indeed every religion can change. And in this respect, Islam is much more open to transformations than Catholicism, especially Sunni Islam, because it has no hierarchy. But the difference, the aggiornamento, the Catholic aggiornamento came from above. The global bishops from the entire world legitimate the transformation of the self-identity of Catholicism, and Catholic culture changes dramatically in a direction in the whole globe. And then it led to the helping transformations of democracies in many countries. Islam has no hierarchy, and the aggiornamentos go in opposite directions. Some go in the direction of pacifism, some go in the direction of violence. Some go in the direction of feminism and women's rights, some go very clear in the direction of the defense of patriarchy against women's rights, and so on. So we could go on, and yes, these are times in which all religious traditions, I mean, I work mainly on religion and globalization, and today all religious traditions are being transformed dramatically by global processes and by relations with one another. So no single tradition stands enclosed in itself. But of course, then there are all possibilities to respond to these global challenges differently. And your work on precisely the Russian Orthodox Church shows how the Russian Orthodox Church now engages these global processes. Before you could accuse the Church of basically not paying attention to the world, and to be now it does pay attention to the world, but it precisely enters those debates in a particular way that it may be questionable to people that defend human rights, democracy, women's rights, gender equality, etc.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Do you want to speak about change as well? And then maybe you want to address the question of Huber Kirchberger as well, which is, you can see in the chat.
And Michaela.
Yeah, I will read Michaela's question afterwards, because I think it goes in a different direction, whereas Huber Kirchberger's question is on you.
No, I think the question of change is very important, and it immediately reminds me of a distinction between two different types of religion that are very close to my own work. The last 2 or 3 years, I studied very intensively Henri Bergson's famous book on the two types of religion. So he distinguishes between static religion and dynamic religion. And dynamic religion is the religion that leads to the open society, and static religion is the religion that comes along with closed society. So if you think about religious support of populism, nationalism today, it's a typical outcome of static religion, whereas all forms that overcome those barriers and those closeness is a typical example of dynamic religion. And today, Pope Francis, but also other people emphasize very strongly for religious reason fraternity. And there was even a common document between the Pope and the great Imam of Cairo on fraternity. And also this new book by the Pope has a very quote he used already several times. He quotes Gustav Mahler that tradition is not the repository of ashes, but the preservation of fire. So that means you have to keep the dynamism going, and I mean he does it with patience, and he said we need a lot of patience, but we need this dynamism. And some of the struggles that's going on in the Catholic Church is just about, should we stay static in the traditional sense, or have we go along with this dynamism? And maybe the most substantial point for the Catholic Church, I think, happened in 2019 in this document with the Grand Imam, where they stated together, and it was, I think, easier for the Muslim side than for the Catholic side, that pluralism is something given by God himself. So the more traditional Christian understanding had a lot of difficulties with religious pluralism and always said there is one religion and ultimately all join together. And now the Pope says pluralism is something that is given by God, wanted by God. That caused a lot of discussion inside the Catholic Church, but it's again going along with this type of dynamism of a dynamic religion. Now to Michael, who is a close friend and Pax Christi member, his question, a mixture of secular and religious causes. Of course, many people are in both camps, but I was thinking about the main problem in Austria, why it's so easy now to have a quite strong majority with a very suspicious attitude towards Muslims, is that secular people have their problems with religion in general, and especially with Islam, and conservative religious people also have their problems with Islam, and they can join together. And of course, sometimes people are partly in both camps, and that's also easy. But if you think, I always think some of the arguments that are used against Islam are also arguments that should be worry Catholics, but the Catholics don't understand it, that some of the attacks against the Muslims would also be, in the long run, creating a lot of difficulties for Catholics. And to think a little bit deeper about that would be very important.
I want to move on to Michaela Quast-Neulinger's question, and I think it's a very important question. So she quotes Philip Jenkins and his thesis of the survival of the strictest. The thesis that the religious moderates will disappear because their branding does not work. And I mean, Jose, you live in the United States, and you are you know that dynamic very well. Michaela asks about Austria. She says, is really Catholicism as such that is back to politics, or isn't it a more specific kind of Catholicism that fits the political agenda? Evangelical, charismatic, traditionalist in gender issues, and liberalist in economy. I think it's a very fitting remark because indeed, as we just said, religions are changing. And we somehow now said, okay, so Catholicism has been dynamic. It has been dynamic to embrace society. But in Catholicism, we have a lot of dynamics that now want to actually get close in again, become more fundamentalist. At the same time, we expect Islam to sort of modernize, but in our own Christian religions, we are seeing the opposite trend. So what do you think?
Well, actually, I gave yesterday at the University of Freiburg in a Haupt seminar precisely a lecture on this topic on global Catholicism, and specifically on what Allen, the journalist, calls evangelical Catholicism. Now, I disagree very strongly with the thesis, which is typical for American Protestantism, that only the strictest religions survive, while the moderate religions accommodate to the world and secularize. This is a very problematic thesis in my view. And of course, it does reflect the relationship of Protestant denominationalism, where you have many different denominations. And then the reading by Catholics that for the Catholic Church to survive should imitate these sects, these strict sects. This is a sectarian model of church. What makes Catholicism different is precisely which is a church for everybody, for the left and the right and the center, and that its rich pluralism, which precisely characterizes it, is a church of the Dominicans and the Franciscans, who are two radically different forms of being orders in the Middle Ages, and of the Jesuits, and of the Opus Dei, and Comunione e Liberazione, and Liberation Theology, and Comunitas and Egidio, and Focolari. Italy is one of the richest and most dynamic places for Catholicism, precisely because of the plurality of religious movements it has of all kinds. Precisely because it doesn't have a national Catholic Church. The papacy protects Italy from having a homogeneous national Catholic Church that controls Catholicism. And so this is one of the paradoxes of Italy. And look at Latin America today. Latin America is the most vibrant, I would say, Catholic region in the world, and the Philippines, but they have all forms of Catholicism competing with one another and competing with Pentecostalism, charismatic forms of Catholicism, liberation theology, all forms of new movements. And so, yes, European societies have a problem because we had a model of church, which was confessional church, linked to the nation state, and we never made really the transition to voluntary congregational, if you wish, forms of religion. The idea that Pope Francis brings is we must understand the church as a community of communities at a level, at the global level, at the national level, and at the parish level. Only if we understand this internal pluralism, each Catholic community must be seen as a community of communities, internally pluralist. It's a very different model than the sectarian model of the Benedictine option or of any kind of, if you wish, fundamentalist Catholicism.
Wolfgang, please.
Just a remark when you said, or Michaela, that moderates will disappear. Maybe moderates will disappear because moderate could also mean lukewarm, you know, and the lukewarm, they should disappear in some way. Would one call Pope Francis a moderate? No, he's not a moderate. He's radical in some way, radical to the spirit of the gospel in some way. And so there is a one thing where a certain type of evangelicals and Pope Francis, and not only Pope Francis, but developments inside the Catholic Church are going in the same direction. And this is if you look about the use of discipleship, missionary discipleship. Pope Francis very much emphasizes that Christians have become missionary disciples. That means not just going to church and doing their so-called religious duties, but really live as Christians according to a special care for the poor, a church going to the margins and so on. So I think this is very important. And you can see in the Anabaptist tradition, they always emphasize discipleship and said in Christendom, everyone was Christian, and it was enough to go to church on Sunday, but you have to do nothing else. And we are now in a very different situation. So if Christian have to be missionary, that doesn't mean we have to go to Latin America or Africa or whatever. And it doesn't mean we have to force people. We still in Europe always want to force people, but just show a model and convince people, persuade people by living a model of Christianity. And in that case, Pope Francis is not moderate at all.
Yes, so we have now another question in the chat, and I think it's also good to go back to speaking a little bit more about Islam, which was really also the reason why we wanted to have this conversation in the first place. So one of our participants asks, how do you perceive Islamophobia studies in Europe and the US? are they productive with regard to prevention? So I think these Islamophobia studies, this is a reference to also a branch of research that has been, at least in Austria, spearheaded by the researcher Farid Hafez, who has also been involved, or sort of he's been a kind of a victim of this anti-Muslim Brotherhood razzia. He's, by the way, also a researcher at the Georgetown University at the Bridge Project. And I want to follow up because there are two more questions on Islam. So let's read them together and tackle the point together. Could you please explain why the notion of political Islam is problematic from a scientific perspective is one question. And the other one is it of any value for rational discourse, this notion of political Islam? If so, what category or categories can be identified to differentiate political forms of Islam from non-political forms of Islam? Or does one have to consider continuity rather than some kind of leap of faith? So let's take some time to Jose to talk about the political Islam and problematize the concept.
Well, let's begin with political Islam, and then I link it to the issue of Islamophobia. Political Islam was a particular, I would argue, temptation of Islam. It became very important, I would say, from the 60s on, and especially after the Iranian Revolution. And of course, has been an issue of experts on Islam, whether political Islam is alive or dead. I'm an expert on Catholicism, both because of my own autobiography, because I know the tradition better, and I always like to compare. Political Catholicism was a temptation in the 30s, when Catholicism understood itself as a third road between liberal, Protestant, democratic, capitalist, bourgeois societies, and communism. The idea that Catholicism is an alternative ideology to precisely liberal democracy and communism. It is this idea that there is a Catholic state, there's a Catholic family, there is a Catholic politics, there is a Catholic economy. This idea was the dominant idea of the 30s. Then came the 60s, and we realized that no, the fundamental notion, there is no Catholic third way, that the only way is for the Catholic tradition to basically defend the dignity of the human person in all institutions, political, economic, but there is no specific Catholic form of family, of a state, of economy, etc. Islam also in the 80s began to view itself as alternative again to capitalism and to socialism. When you put it like that, then you realize that you are really, really understanding yourself as an ideology, modern ideology, in competition with the others. As long as Islam views itself like that and presents itself as the solution for the form of a state, the form of economy, the form of family, then indeed it becomes the same kind of formation. I think that in the same way that we went in the 30s from political Catholicism to Christian democracy, Islam was undergoing a very similar process. We see it in Turkey, the AKP, first with Erdogan. We've seen it out in Tunisia. So very clearly, in Islam, you see a transition in many places, precisely, or a competition between the idea of political Islam and the idea of a Muslim democracy or democracy with Muslim characteristics. So again, this is, we could go on, and we must understand that there are many, many Muslim democratic societies in the world, which, despite the many difficulties, function well as democracies. Indonesia, Senegal, Bangladesh, we could go on to differentiate different types. There are many different types of forms of democracy, authoritarian regimes within Islam, as within any other tradition. On Islamophobia, I would briefly say, I personally do not like the concept itself so much, but I do agree that in Europe, we did develop a series of discourses that gang together, and I'm going to go on the issue that Wolfgang already mentioned. It's not only secular and religious, but you have from the extreme right, you could call it the racist, fascist right, that rejects Muslims because they are not Europeans, not whites, to Christian Democrats that reject it because they are not Christians, to precisely liberals because they are not liberal, feminists because they are not feminists, secular radicals because and all of them for different reasons somehow came together to oppose Islam. And in this respect, yes, there was a sense within Muslim societies that the discourse on Islam became phobic, the same way that there was a time when the discourse on Judaism was phobic in all European societies. Today, nobody will speak of Jews the way people speak of Muslims today, and nobody will accept the caricatures of Jews that were done in the 30s. But caricatures on Muslims are fine on the Muslim traditions. And then in the name of the defense of freedom, then we have the right to blasphemy. So we have to be very careful how do we use these concepts. So I'm not particularly a fan of the very project of, if you wish, studying Islamophobia. But there is a lot of prejudices, unfounded prejudices, based on ignorance and if you wish, on mixture of categories. When it comes to Islam in Europe, this I fully agree.
Mm-hmm. May I just explain a little bit, because I used that before, that I see the term political Islam as scientifically useless and also very dangerous in the social discussion in Austria. And there are two reasons for it. If you say the main problem is political Islam, you in some way insinuate a good Islam would be a non-political Islam. So a non-political Islam would mean a good religion has to be a private religion. And this is something a Catholic cannot agree with, a Muslim cannot agree with. Also, almost all Protestants could not agree with. So I come from a tradition where political theology, or today I more prefer theological politics, is very important. That religion has, of course, a political dimension. And I always like to quote in that regard Gandhi, who said, all my doing is, of course, deeply coming from my religious perspectives. And Gandhi, in that case, was a political active religious person, although he was also in favor of a secular Indian state constitution. So we should not mix those things together. So the first problem with the term political Islam is that you insinuate only a private religion is a good religion, and this is wrong. And the second thing is you expose Islam as in general as something dangerous, because for the average people in Austria, and I know it from many discussions with people in Austria, when you hear in the media every day political Islam is the most dangerous thing, how can people distinguish between people who are faithful, honest people like myself, and terrorists? Because for the average experience and the attitude, this discourse of political Islam makes a mixture, so that an average Austrian who sees a woman with a headscarf on the street, he thinks immediately political Islam. It's dangerous. So I would say, if we want to have a term to express the dangerous things, we should talk about extremism, we should talk about violent jihadism or terrorism. So we have a lot of terms, and we don't need to insinuate political religion is wrong. But again, this is a term, the Christian Democrats like this term because it's political Islam, and the Greens and the seculars like it because it's a political religion and not a private religion. And so therefore we have to find other terms if we want to help a good living together between different religions and cultures in Austria. What we have done in the last 10 years or 5 years is to make the cleavages between Austrians, Muslims, migrants, and so on deeper. And if you look, just a very critical remark, the people in the government who are forcing this discourse, they say, we talk to experts. They have now also a scientific board who does these investigations on political Islam. I mean, most of those so-called scholars who are on this board are second-rate scholars, really second-rate scholars, or scholars who have a clearly political approach. So most, not all, but I would say 70-80% of the members of this board have published in the last 10 years very critical books and articles about Islam. So they are welcome. It's not a board where really the experts in a very broad variety are coming together. So Rüdiger Lolka, very important expert on Islam in Vienna, he really said it's a shame that we use this term.
Okay, thank you. I want to follow up, and also Wolfgang. I mean, on the question of you said Christian democracy, Muslim democracy, and I think I want to throw in a third term, and that's liberal democracy. And I mean, obviously, there are tensions. And I mean, just think about the situation that has been created inside the European Union with Hungary or with Poland. And the debate about the rule of law in these countries is precisely sort of attached to questions that are that have something to do with Christian traditional Christian teaching. So in Poland, it's now a debate on abortion, and in Hungary, right, just this week, a law was passed that defines a family as being between a man and a woman, and this will have implications for couples who want to adopt. So it will only be heterosexual couples that can adopt children. And the claim that is being made is that, so this is our Christian understanding of democracy. And of course, until very, very recently, that was also the Austrian Christian understanding of democracy. And this is why a verdict now by the Supreme Court on assisted suicide in Austria kind of disorients, because suddenly Austrian politics, the church, and Austrians sort of discover ourselves as actually much more progressive and liberal as maybe people have seen each other. So you said, okay, all this is compatible with democracy, and that's right, because it can have democratic institutions, elections, and so on. But obviously, some things will not be compatible with a progressive liberal understanding of democracy, which arguably is the one that is now dominant in international institutions and even in the European Union, where it really stands behind equal gender rights. This does clash, and we don't need to look to Turkey. It already clashes in Budapest.
Well, it clashes to a certain extent. This clashes everywhere today. I have always looked at it historically. When I said Christian democracy as a positive step, it was because Catholicism in the 30s was anti-democratic. And therefore, when Catholics following Maritain embraced democracy, it was a positive pass. It's not because their democracy was Christian, but that the Christians were for democracy, and therefore the organization of Christian democratic parties was a very positive development. So this is the first thing. Now, we know historically that in the middle of the 19th century, liberals were anti-democrats and Democrats were anti-liberal, because democracy is the principle of majority rule, but majority rule was viewed as the tyranny of the majority that may challenge the liberties of individuals and rights of individuals and liberties. So, and today we see also the separation of liberalism. You have liberals that challenge the majority rule because majority rule may be anti-liberal, and also the rule of law. Many of these democracies, let's say in Poland and in Hungary, in the name of majority rule, they are against the rule of law, and precisely because it's constitutional restraints that protects fundamental values and liberties, and they are against liberalism because they say those are values that are not ours. So indeed, how to bring together these three principles of a rule of law that protects then the rights of every individual and constitutional institutional processes, of liberalism that indeed protects special liberties and a changing conception of liberties, and equality. There is a fundamental conflict in democracies. We know it from the time of Tocqueville between liberty and equality. And this continues. So the question is, how do we find the right balance? And many of the conflicts today in the United States, today it is the conservatives that are the defenders of liberties against the equality that is the one of extension of rights to everybody. So you have how these conflicts change in the history of democracy, and we must understand them historically and try to understand. But it's not anymore only Hungary and Poland. Today, those conflicts, those tensions, and those difficulties are visible everywhere in all democracies around the world.
Wolfgang, we are already nearing the end of our discussion, because I actually do try to keep this to an hour, because that's kind of the time span that people can stay concentrated. And so maybe you want to address the last question in the chat. I think you see it. And you maybe also want to address. Yeah, you want to address
Yeah, I think what Jose just said, this tension between equality and liberty, it's very important to realize that the tension and don't paper it over. Very often people think it's easy to have those both things. They go together easily, and they don't go together easily at all. There will always be a tension. But it's interesting that in the recent 10 years, in the last 10 years, many thinkers and people reflected on fraternity. You know, if we go back to the French Revolution, we have equality, liberty, fraternity, and fraternity is in some way was often overlooked, not really addressed at all. But the fraternity is the precondition of democracy. And it's interesting, one of the harshest critiques of Austrian Catholicism, Hans Kelsen, who was the so-called father of the Austrian Constitution, and we celebrated just this year or last year 100 years of this constitution. Hans Kelsen was very critical, and like Jose said it before, Hans Kelsen wrote in the 30s that Catholicism will never be able to become democratic. So that was his attitude. But it's very interesting, in one of his small books about worldview, Weltanschauung, and democracy, he refers to a very old Indian saying, the so-called Tatvamasi, that democracy only works if you see your political opponent as someone who belongs also to yourself. So democracy can only work if you see the human community as a fraternity in some way. So if you see the other as completely other, the interplay between majority and minority doesn't work. So Kelsen, who was very liberal on these things, very anti-Catholic at that time, understood the importance of fraternity. Also, Pope Francis, in his Fratelli Tutti, he makes a little chapter on equality, liberty, fraternity, and we need to strengthen fraternity. And I think what Wilhelm Krautwaschel, a prominent Catholic bishop and participating with us, just asked us about the so-called Böckenförde paradox. I think one of the things is also this spirit of fraternity that is so needed, and we discover it today more. And you can even go to a liberal political theorist like Norberto Bobbio, when he also, in his book on democracy, emphasizes that democracy needs certain virtues, and he also mentioned fraternity. So I think that's an important role, but only dynamic religion is really supporting of fraternity. Static religion is like a tribal religion, so it has its close borders. So there is not the spirit of fraternity. So it's very interesting, again, to go back to Bergson and see that one of the philosophers who helped us to create Christian democracy, Jacques Maritain, came out of this Bergsonian fraternal tradition. and Pope Francis also is very much connected to that. I think it has also to do that Maritain was very influential in Latin America. So Catholicism in Latin America in regard to their political views, they all studied in the 50s and 60s Maritain, who belongs to this fraternal tradition. So in that direction, I would say there is this importance of the religious support of democracy in the sense of Böckenförde.
Well, I would add two things, fraternity or solidarity, which is the parallel concept, which is crucial, right? Solidarity, if we look at the solidarity movement, what made it so great is that it brought together three principles of solidarity. The Catholic fraternity or Catholic solidarity, socialist working class solidarity, and national solidarity. Ultimately, we the people, you need some type of solidarity to have a democracy. Without solidarity, there is no democracy. That's clear. The question is whether it's solidarity which is exclusive or inclusive. And just a point on Maritain. Maritain was crucial in the 30s already. Maritain, who of course lived through these processes through the Spanish Civil War. It was the Spanish Republic that forced Catholics to be for democracy or not. And precisely then, in Chile, what was called first Falange, imitating the name of the movement in Spain, later became Christian democracy, already in the 30s. So Chile had a Christian Democratic Party that joined the Popular Front in the 40s before the end of World War II. In Europe, Christian Democratic parties emerged after World War II. In Chile, already emerged in the 30s, precisely because of the influence of Maritain.
Okay, thank you very much. So I sort of take the answer to be to the question of Bishop Krautwaschel that what democracy may need, sort of the answer to the Böckenförde paradox is inclusive solidarity. That was the term by Jose.
Well, it needs some fundamental values which themselves are not open to, if you wish, majority rule. So you need some fundamental values which are, and then taken for granted. So you begin with a taken for granted fundamental values. This is the way every basically democratic constitution begins, right? The preambles to the constitution where the values are written. So you need the values before you actually can really then begin the actual process of dividing power and how to arbitrate between liberty and equality. But some fundamental values have to be there. And as the U.S. Constitution said, they must be taken for granted. They are not open to, if you wish, debate or to. And so it is these kind of values ultimately, and these, of course, what also the Grundrechte of the German Constitution and Böckenförde precisely imply. Those are fundamental values that we come to see are not open to, if you wish, political competition or the legislation of majorities to either restrict or eliminate. So in this respect, yes, Böckenförde is right. Those are fundamental values which are the basis for democracy. Without it, you cannot have a democracy.
Okay, thank you. Wolfgang, you...
Just one sentence. I would underline what Michaela Quast-Neulinger wrote in the chat, that the use of discipleship by Pope Francis and some of the Austrian Catholic charismatics is quite different. So they both talk about mission and discipleship, but if you look into the content, the one is inclusive and the other is more exclusive. So it's not mission and discipleship without seeing what kind of discipleship and what kind of mission.
Okay, so thank you very much. We have no more questions in the chat, and we've also sort of filled our hour. And as I said, I think 1 hour is a good time to stay concentrated in front of a screen. The purpose of the discussion was to to discuss, but also in a way to complicate many of the assumptions that have accompanied recent debates in Austria on religion and democracy. And I think we've succeeded in that. So thank you very much, Jose, and thank you, Wolfgang, for joining the discussion and helping us to navigate this very difficult landscape. I have made the experience that it's always really abrupt to close a conference. So what I've now decided to do is that I don't close the conference, so you just leave. and people who want to continue discussion, they may even ask. So I think we'll just hang on for another kind of few minutes. And so I thank very much our audience and for joining us, for listening to us. And I also want to advertise that we have a YouTube channel where you will be able to listen to or to re-listen to our debate. And as I said, so now the discussion is closed. This is the moment where in the room people can stand up and can start to leave, but some people always walk up to the speakers and have questions. So here we are. And thank you very much. And have a nice day.
Vielen Dank, Kristina, für die Einladung. Vielen Dank alle für Zuhören und für die Fragen. Und auch, lieber Wolfgang, Sir, ich bin sehr froh, dass wir die Gelegenheit hatten, zusammen ein bisschen zu diskutieren und unsere Gedanken auszudrücken. So, also vielen Dank, Kristina, für die Einladung. Vielen Dank alle.
Ja, ich sage auch danke.